Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Note to self, when you invite politicians to speak and give them a 10-minute time limit. I'm kidding. That's fine. It was great to have Melanie come out and coordinate an appearance, and I enjoyed both of those. I have a longer presentation tonight, and we're starting late, so I'm going to go through it a little quicker and skip a few things. But we're going to run past 7:30 for sure, because we're almost there already. But I'll do what I can. The last few weeks, I've talked to you guys a little about the central banks and the central banker, and basically all wars are banker wars. He who controls the supply of money rules the world. Well, I'm going to talk about the other bankers now. And the title of this tonight is American Fascists. And I guess I'm going to kind of contrast the banking world. You've got the private central banks that lend money to governments. And those would be the Rothschilds, all the European banks, and finally our Federal Reserve. And they're the ones who feed into the Bank of International Settlements. But then you've got the commercial banks and the Wall Street banks, and they're doing their wheeling and dealing and buying corporations and sitting on each other's boards of directors. And the two sometimes overlap and work together, and sometimes are vehemently opposed to each other. And the 20th century really showed you the opposition. Louder? Yeah. Thank you. So if you imagine, and I'm going to use some broad stereotypes, and I could spend hours telling you why these aren't accurate. But if you think about the central banks, they're the ones who created the Bolsheviks in 1917. They're communists. They want one world government. They've always been the globalists. Okay, these are the Rothschilds, etc. When I talk about the American fascists, we're talking about the Wall Street banks, the corporations that came out of the Gilded Age, Carnegie's, the Steel, and people like that. And that's a different form of banking, but at the end of the day, they were fascists by the textbook definition of fascism, which is basically, the corporations and the federal government working together. And what they end up doing is they subsidize the losses and they privatize the gains, which is basically what we're going to talk about today. Really interesting way of looking at it. The fascists use money to gain power, whereas the globalists use power to gain wealth. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The central bankers, they've got all the money in the world because they print it out of thin air. They use their money to gain power. All right, they've got the globalist agenda, the depopulation, all that kind of stuff. These capitalists, these American fascists we're going to talk about, they use power. They got themselves into positions of power in the U.S. government so they could get rich. So it's a little bit different context. I'll let you guess who's going to win in the end. So we're going to go back, starting around the Gilded Age, late 1800s. We talked about that a little bit before. I'm going to walk you through the 1910s, up in the 1920s, what happened, what led into this World War II. And if we get further, I'll give you a little bit more of how it goes. At the end of the day, what I'm describing is how American politics, basically who rules over us, it's really it's a criminal enterprise run by our corporations, our intelligence agencies, and the actual criminal underworld. And how did that come to? That's basically that's been the status quo since sometime in the 40s, and it happened in World War II. I'm going to try to get you through all that, give you a little bit more background. Then I'm going to start hitting you with a bunch of facts, just things that happened, dates, times, and you're going to start hearing a bunch of patterns. The same names, the same families, the same schools, the same firms. They all work together. And so let me introduce you to some of the players in this little plot. Anybody heard of Brown Brothers Harriman? Yeah. You have. Sure have. Brown Brothers Harriman is an elite Wall Street bank. The key name in this is Harriman. That cater to the needs of the wealthiest American titans of the industry and a few families. We're talking about basically 30 to 50 corporations and families in America, turn of the century, the 20th century, and a lot of these families are still intact today, all sitting on each other's boards of directors and doing everything like that. It's basically the next evolution of the Gilded Age, where the robber barons were doing the same thing. The next big player, and I was going to title this whole thing Sullivan Cromwell. Has anybody heard of Sullivan Cromwell?
Sure.
2 for 2.
Two brothers.
Yeah. Not brothers. Sullivan and Cromwell.
No, I'm not talking about them.
Oh.
I'm talking about the guys that actually ran the CIA and everything.
Yeah, we're gonna get there. in about-
That's who-
You're about 10 minutes ahead of me. Yeah, but you know exactly where I'm going with it. So he's talking about the Dulles brothers, just to give it away. Sullivan and Cromwell was the premier Wall Street law firm. Before we had intelligence agencies, which came around right around 1940s, corporations had to carry on their own coups of foreign countries. Sounds kind of really hard. If I got to go take over a country, I got to do it myself. This actually was going on in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Our mega corporations were basically going down and turning banana republics into banana republics. But how'd they do it? They didn't have a military force. Well, they used Sullivan and Cromwell. It's this incredibly very mean law firm. Sullivan and Cromwell is where you wanted to go if you wanted a coup. They've had their fingers in just about every shady foreign deal or entanglement since. They would structure deals for the big investors, always got their money back first, and the smaller investors didn't get much. Something went wrong. It hasn't changed much since then. It's been a revolving door between their lawyers and the government for quite some time. And sometimes Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers will work for Sullivan and Cromwell and the US government at the same time. There's dozens of examples of this over the last century. So, and it's the most powerful law firm Americans ever seen. And they keep a really low profile, which is why it's not a household name. And how many people here have heard of Perkins Coie? Yeah. Sullivan and Cromwell makes them look like not child's play, because Perkins Coie is pretty darn big, but yeah, it's a different league. So where'd Sullivan and Cromwell come from? This guy named Algernon Sullivan was the founder. He was married to a George Washington descendant, and she was a pro-South, big racist, pro-slavery gal. All of his clients were Southern businessmen. When they wanted to do business in New York, they went to him. Well, in the early 1870s, he took on a younger partner, 25-year-old guy by the name of Cromwell. A few years later, Sullivan passes away, but his name's still part of the firm. Cromwell's just a young guy, and we have no idea how he got so influential, but some of his early clients were people by the last name of Morgan, Rockefeller, Harriman, Goldman Sachs, etc. Some of the examples of what Cromwell was doing back in the time. Panama Canal. Everybody heard of that? Anybody ever heard of the Nicaraguan Canal? Well, that's because of Cromwell. Most of the southern states were trying to build a canal in Nicaragua. They've been working on that for a couple of decades. This gets back post-Civil War, just shortly thereafter, because southern producers want to be able to ship their stuff to California. And that they hadn't quite gotten that going. Well, the French started a Panama Canal in the 1870s. They built a little bit of it for about 5 years. It turned out like 30,000 of their workers didn't make it through that, and the whole thing got shut down. Long story short, one of the French builders ended up talking to Cromwell. Cromwell goes and does his thing, lobbies Congress, talks to some rich people and stuff like that. Says, okay, we're going to build the Panama Canal. And he figures out where he wants to do it. The problem is there's no such thing as Panama at the time. Oh, no, it was part of Colombia. No, Cromwell took care of that, got the canal built in about 20 years. And that's what he did. It was basically a coup. They stole land. It was all done through legal devices, not a shot fired. This is we call it, you want to talk about lawfare? That's what that kind of power Cromwell had. A couple of other things they did. There were U.S. corporations were basically getting the. Remember we talked about what was it? Smedley Butler, the Marine, where they tried to use the business plot and overthrow the government in the 30s. Talk about him later, but he was talking about is we were using the U.S. Marine Corps to hit up all these, to basically invade these banana republics at the behest of American corporations. These are the post-robber baron guys. That's basically we invaded Cuba, Philippines. We invaded Hawaii. One of these guys. That's how Hawaii became a U.S. state. We took over them. So what was going on is right at the end of the Gilded Age, we had all these corporations were run in trusts. They talk about busting the trusts. The trust buster, Teddy Roosevelt. Partially accurate. So trusts were no longer going to be a legal entity, and they had to figure this out. And if I find this exactly where this is, basically they created this concept called U.S. corporation. And the idea was that's how U.S. Steel, Cromwell met with J.P. Morgan and said, okay, we can find you a way to make this gigantic gigantic company with all kinds of limited liability for you. Morgan goes, okay, I'll listen. And that's how the first U.S. corporation. The second U.S. corporation was Edison General Electric. That was Cromwell. He invented all these corporations. So basically, you do business as sole proprietor. You can get sued if you do something wrong. Now I want to be a corporation so they can never touch me. They can only get my shareholders. That's the whole idea. No transparency, none of that. That's what the corporation's all about. You can thank Cromwell for that one. So we're talking about cronyism, corruption, at a bunch of different levels. The whole idea, big picture, taking a step back, is one of the big things we're facing today is our corporations have way too much power, but you do not have the corporations without the lawyers and all the laws that they create around them. And all the laws are created by the people who own the corporations. This is a top-down type thing. The rest of us get to follow their laws and they carve themselves out. Yes, sir.
We even have, they're seen as people, corporate personhood.
That came later,
Yeah.
but now they are, the Supreme Court has ruled that a corporation is a person. I don't agree for a lot of reasons. All right, so example of how corrupt everything was. You probably haven't heard of a guy by the name of John Sherman of Ohio. He was actually a presidential candidate. He was a U.S. Senate from Ohio, and he was pushed by one of the real big corporatists or early robber barons, a guy by the name of Mark Hanna. So he didn't go anywhere in '92, but remember the name Sherman. So Sherman, Hanna, he's a billionaire, not to be dissuaded, found another candidate in 1896, a guy by the name of William McKinley, who would become President McKinley. And Hanna goes to Washington, D.C., and he greases a bunch of palms, and somehow McKinley gets the Republican nomination and wins. Hanna buys up a bunch of newspapers to help push McKinley. That's easy to do. If you own the press, your campaign goes pretty well, and he ends up winning. McKinley was the most pro-industry, pro-capitalist president in history. He launched the Spanish-American War. So these corporations like Dole and U.S. Fruit and everything like that were able to go and take the raw materials in places like Philippines. All the Spanish territories we took on was because this guy Hanna put McKinley in office. But it gets better. So John Sherman, who was basically gets named to be the Secretary of State for this new president, for McKinley. So it means he vacated his own Senate seat, and guess who got himself named to be the Senate? Was Hanna himself. So we got Hanna, his guy McKinley, and his guy Sherman basically running U.S. foreign policy, and that's how we got the Spanish-American War, all for profits. So just a little example. Interestingly, McKinley was shot in 1801, and his vice president was Teddy Roosevelt. This is important. Roosevelt did his trust busting theoretically. He was part of the progressive agenda. Progressive era is now upon us. The reason we had the progressive agenda is because the robber barons were so vile and disgusting towards their workers. All these immigrants come off the boat, they go to a city, you got to work in a factory for basically $1 a day and it costs $1.25 to live, doesn't work out very well. The only way you can get a job is go to the ward boss. Ward boss says you get a job, you vote for my candidate. That's the way politics were back then. That's why the union movement started in America. And with it came the Fabian socialists and the progressive movement. Some pros, a lot of cons to all that, but that's why it happened. American capitalists got too greedy and they had no regulation on them whatsoever. I'm not going to prescribe a solution to that tonight. Fast forward to the election of 1912. Taft was a guy that Teddy Roosevelt had put into office. He didn't rerun in 1908. So Taft's the sitting president. Well, he was not friendly enough to Teddy Roosevelt's backers, whoever they might have been. Those would have been the globalist banks, who really wanted Woodrow Wilson to be the president in 1912 election. It's a really important election. But Taft was pretty popular, and Taft's name's going to come up later on. So what does Teddy Roosevelt do? He runs as the Bull Moose Party candidate to take away part of Taft's votes. Same thing you might have seen in '92. They got Clinton in with Ross Perot. Long story short, Clinton got 43% of the vote. Woodrow Wilson got 42%. So it's about the same thing. Woodrow Wilson gets elected president. The Federal Reserve comes in, and we talked about that already. World War I starts. Wilson was actually trying to stay out of the war as a progressive until a German U-boat sank the Lusitania. So here's where it gets fun. We get some of these connecting names. A guy by the name of Robert Lansing was an advisor on European affairs to Wilson, and he was trying to persuade Wilson to join World War I. William Jennings Bryan, who was a huge populist guy, who did a lot of things that we would agree with today, even though he's a 3-time Democratic president, didn't win any of those times. A brilliant orator. I've talked about him before. He was anti-war. He resigned when Wilson was looking into going into the war. So Lansing also becomes the Secretary of State. Fun connections. Lansing was the son-in-law of a guy by the name of John W. Foster. Ever heard that? Well, he was Secretary of State 10 years previously. So the pattern we're going to see is the same people are in the Secretary of State, intelligence, all the positions of power. They're all related time and time again. So we got Lansing, the son-in-law of John W. Foster, wants to get into war. Foster is the guy who overthrew the Hawaiian Islands and made them a colony. 1918, Wilson has a stroke. So now Lansing is now chairing all the cabinet meetings and implementing a bunch of pro-robber baron and pro-business policies. 1917, US joins the war. Real quick, 1917 aside, the Bolsheviks take over Russia, USSR is founded. That was financed by the British central banks, the Rothschilds, absolutely. It was also financed by a few Wall Street banks. In fact, the only reason I believe it was, wasn't Stalin, it was one of their top 2 or 3 guys, and I'll think of his name later on, had to leave the United States, needed Woodrow Wilson's permission to go there to help with the revolution. So the Bolshevik Revolution had our blessing. Interestingly enough, the agents that England and America sent there, because we're in World War I and the Russians were fighting the Germans, the British Round Table guys, which would be one of their cloak and dagger secret societies, could go there under normal British cover. But since America was not an ally of Russia, we sent our people who was over there to work with the Bolsheviks, to work with the Red Cross. They all have Red Cross badges on there. We went send them undercover, which is interesting. Red Cross has been involved in a lot of cloak and daggery. What's that?
You wanted to say Trotsky?
Was it
Stalin, Trotsky?
was it Trotsky who was in America that Wilson gave him? It might have been it. That might have been Trotsky. One of the 2 or 3 big ones. You would know better than I would.
Yeah.
We have a Russian in the room.
Hungarian, no
Sorry.
Russian.
We have Eastern Bloc in the room. All you communists look alike to me. Ex-communist. So the war ends, and we get to the Versailles Treaty. Here's where it gets really fun. Treaty of Versailles, 1919. Interesting people that Winston Churchill was there. We had a lot of time. I go deep into Winston Churchill, but I'm gonna leave him out of this because I have a whole bunch of Churchill quotes. He's a very interesting guy. Lansing, still the Secretary of State. He's the head of the negotiations. He brings with him John Foster Dulles and Adam Dulles. They were grandsons of John W. Foster, who we talked about earlier. It was the Dulles brothers who imposed the war reparations on Germany. They also helped create the Council of Foreign Relations. So we're talking about a couple guys, they're only in their 20s at the time. So how did they get this much power? We'll get there. Dulles was working for Sullivan Cromwell, became the lawyer for Germany. So he's an American lawyer working for Germany, negotiating the Treaty of Versailles. He was also the lawyer for Brown Brothers Harriman, the big Wall Street bank. Any conflicts of interest there at all? Yeah. And Brown Brothers Harriman, whose private investment clients, they were lending their money to Germany to rebuild it immediately after World War I. Dulles was also working on and off for the US State Department. He's a busy guy. At the time, the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman was a gentleman by the name of George Herbert Walker. Does that sound familiar? Oh, it's going to get better. A lot of these loans were being paid to pay reparations to companies that were also clients of Brown Brothers Harriman and Dillon Reed, another big exclusive bank. These are what we call the true blue bloods of America. The blue bloods, the Ivy League people like that, the ones we all aspire to, some people aspire to be. Germany would issue bonds. Brown Brother Harriman's clients would buy it. Brown Brother Harriman's clients would then invest in these German companies. Their corporations, Ford Motor Company was big in this. They're basically funding to rebuild the German machine. And the whole purpose is they want to stand against this threat of Bolshevism. And I think kind of part of what happened was when they created the Bolsheviks, it was basically the first Marxist experiment. The reason they wanted to overthrow the Russian czars is because they represented competition for Wall Street. And the reason the British bankers wanted to overthrow them was because I don't know what the British bankers think. Probably world domination. Long story short, they overthrew the Russian government. We got the Bolsheviks in place. People were very scared. These businesses were afraid of communists because they saw what they did in Moscow and Russia. They murdered everybody. They destroyed businesses and stuff like that. Now, if you're running a multi-generational business, whether it's clean or not, the last thing you want is communism. It's a scary thing. And these people were serious. There was definitely blood on their minds. And international communism, I don't think is what they originally intended, but as soon as the Bolsheviks got in power, they basically made it really clear to the world they wanted one world government and it's all going to be communist. And they wanted everyone, and all the Wall Street financiers, they said, well, that ain't going to happen on our watch. We're going to build up Germany to be a bulwark against this. Okay. No matter what it takes, where it gets fun. Billions of dollars invested in Germany to build Germany back up. Lansing is instrumental in mounting a foreign military expedition force into Russia in 1918. The idea was to aid the white Russians, that's in quotes, these are basically nobility Russians that were trying to fight against the Bolsheviks. That did not last very long. But you can tell that American foreign policy was already anti-communist, and it is being shaped by the Dulles brothers and friends. George Herbert Walker would step down from Brown Brothers Harriman to set up what's called Union Bank of New York. The new CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman is someone you may have heard of, a gentleman by the name of Prescott Bush, Walker's son-in-law. Now you see the connections. Walker had been hired by Sullivan and Cromwell, and later talked Cromwell into hiring his son, John Foster Dulles. Union Bank of New York opened a subsidiary Dutch Bank of Shipping and Commerce, which gave loans to the Nazi Party. That's how the Nazi, we're up to like 1933 now. They were building up the Weimar Republic from 1924 to 1933, but then hyperinflation hits because of some of the reparations and banking issues. January 3rd, 1933, famous date. There's a meeting between the Dulles brothers and a gentleman by the name of Adolf Hitler. Hitler signs an agreement to repay all the loans made by Brown Brothers Harriman. That's how he got into power. Dulles, then Allen Dulles, then gives the green light to Hitler becoming the chancellor of Germany. Anybody seen a pattern yet? Our corporations are doing foreign policy. Have you heard anything about the State Department or a president involved in any of these things? It's a private foreign policy machine. All of this is done with the approval of maybe 30 men who are investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman, and the stockholders are about 50 of the biggest US corporations, like Ford and some of the banks. They monopolize all industries in the US, steel, railroad, blah, blah, blah. Where's it get fun? So what else is going on in 1933? The business plot, which we talked about before. There was a plot against FDR. So these Wall Street titans with their central banking buddies had kind of screwed up in the 20s and created a global market crash in 1929. Might have heard about the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And that started with a run on the banks in 1929 and the Wall Street collapse. Manufactured by both sides, all the bankers were responsible for this. They were using leverage, taking on greed. They were absolutely doing stuff that would get them arrested, maybe today, depending on who they knew. Long story short, the world's in a global depression, and that brings in FDR, who's a populist, who's anti-establishment and stuff like that. Well, this concerns these American fascists, these blue bloods and stuff like that. You get a populist who's a socialist, and socialism leads to communism, and they ain't happy, but they're worried about this because FDR is very popular. You know, he's giving out a lot of free stuff to a bunch of people that are suffering, and these fat cats are not feeling too good. So they create the business plot. They try to overthrow FDR. A coup in the United States of America. We've talked about this before. They basically got Major General Smedley Butler from the Marines. Said, okay, we've got all this money we're going to throw behind you. You're going to be in charge of the armed forces. Let's overthrow FDR. And on go day, Smedley Butler says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm a man of honor. Goes to Congress and tells his story. Once again, none of these people ever went to jail or was punished. But FDR is probably not very happy with him, right?
It's like the same thing that's happening now. No one's punished.
Yeah, well, that's patterns repeat, don't they? Same as ever was. So what these captains of industry wanted was to reshape the nature of business and the government. When basically they wanted businesses and the government to be partners, but different than what the central banks did earlier. Because the central banks didn't actually want to run the government because they ran the money. They didn't need to be in the government. The government was there as a junior partner. It's basically fascism 101. Fascism doesn't have to be killing everyone like that. It just seems like it always ends up that way, because you're talking about a corporate tyranny. Basically a bunch of boards of directors run anything for, and the politicians always going to answer them because the money answers everything. That's what they wanted. That's why they were funding. That's why they decided to fund the Nazi partner, Nazi party and stuff like that. They wanted the same thing in America. In 1933, one of them happened, one of them didn't, because of Smedley Butler. Otherwise, world history would have been very, very different. So fast forward to 1939, Germany invades Poland. Launches World War II, and our lovely band of meddlers pushes back against the US getting involved in the war. So our corporations have been lending money and buying shares in all these German companies and helping build up this German war machine to be a bulwark against, they don't want America joining the war against their financial interests. And FDR wants to get into the war because, he's a socialist. He's part of the British Fabian socialist, maybe communist wing, which basically we say Russia, England, FDR, if you want to talk ideologically. And, these businessmen who are, that we're talking about, they wanted nothing to do with it. They actually kept the US out of the war for a couple of years. Poland and France fall, England's getting firebombed, and still no US, because FDR couldn't mobilize enough support to go to war. Are there any other ulterior motives to keep the US out of the war? We'll get into that another time. So there's pretty good evidence that FDR actually lured the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor to get us into the war. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence on there. I'm not going to say one way or the other, but a lot of pretty reputable historians would agree with that statement. The US and England had rejected Hitler's overtures to join against the Soviets. Free capitalist societies to fight against the Marxists. Now, England and the United States, FDR and Churchill said no to that. They would rather say we're going to go against the fascists in Germany, which is a decent choice as well, because I'm certainly not preaching fascism here.
Well, Brady, remember what Churchill said when Pearl Harbor was bombed? He said, "We just won the war."
Yeah, I do recall that. I got a whole sheet of Churchill quotes, but that's going to take a step. We'll do that another time. It's a good one though, Bill. Bill said that when Pearl Harbor was bombed, Churchill said, "Oh, we just won the war." So the corporatists. All right, so it's interesting. It's US and England had, this drove Hitler to ally with Japan when we turned down those overtures. Pearl Harbor happens. US declares war on Japan, but not Germany. Then Germany declares war on the United States because we bombed their ally, or we were in a war with their ally. The corporatists continue to fund Germany, stealing explosives, stuff like that, to help fight the war, even after Germany declared war on the United States. So we're talking treason. Until the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act was finally enforced in 1942 and was used to seize property of people like the Bushes, Brown Brother Harriman, etc. So they finally cracked down on them in 1942. US German corporations continued looting other companies all over Europe. So even though we've been shut down from doing anything with Europe, American corporations had shell corporations in Germany. And as the German war machine rolls into Poland, they just roll up any business they want, put it into their corporate shell and start making money. These are war profiteers. We've got them here in America. A lot of corporations make a lot of money on war. A lot of small companies too. Been going on as long as
the lobbyists.
It's a lot of them. So what happens? Brown Brothers Harriman clients hire Allen Dulles to help the corporatists make their ownership in the corporations in what is known as the Dulles cloaking scheme. So this lawyer from Brown Brothers, from Sullivan and Cromwell, figured out a way to hide their corporate interests from the US government, so we can't get the Trading with the Enemy Act. It's kind of very dirty, but lawyerly. So FDR then has a sort of a detente with all these corporate titans. Detente, is that, anybody know? Detente, thank you. I have a tough time. There's words I've read forever and I never said them out loud. When I finally say it, I just blow it. My mom makes fun of it. So FDR has a detente with these people because he needs their help. and he brings them into these businessmen, bankers, and lawyers into the War Department to help manage the business side of the war. No, it was needed. Was needed, and they were good at it. The SS Normandy. Here's what gets fun. The SS Normandy gets set fire and capsized in Manhattan Harbor. What was going on is the Nazis. Now we're in the war with the Nazis. This is about 1942. We had a bunch of Nazi spies in New York, and they sabotaged one of our ships and stuff like that. And we don't want our ships being sabotaged, stuff like that. So how are you going to control the New York wharf and everything like that? Well, so the ONI, which is the Office of Naval Intelligence, turns to an unlikely source for help to deal with the dockside problems. Who do you think really controls the docks in New York City?
Mafia.
Bingo, mafia. So the ONI turns to the mafia to clear out the docks. The mafia already hates Nazis and fascists because of Mussolini. He locked up most of the mafiosos in Sicily already 10 years earlier. So they've got a grudge, and they go, yeah, we'll love to join the war to defeat the Nazis and fascists. So what was called Operation Underworld is launched, and this is, we already have a partnership with the government and these bankers and stuff like that. Well, now we got organized crime entering into it. Once they get their hooks into you, you probably don't get away. So the way this went down, and it's kind of a fun story. Guy by the name of Thomas Dewey. You've heard of Dewey versus Truman. So this is in 1943. He ran against Truman in 1944 and lost, although he won and then lost. At the time, he's the governor of New York, and he had just sent Lucky Luciano 2 years earlier to a lifetime prison sentence. So he goes in, he sends one of his aides, guy by the name of Murray Durfind, to visit Lucky Luciano in prison, and he gives him an idea. He says, look, I'll give you clemency on 2 conditions. One, you return to Sicily and use La Cosa Nostra to serve as scouts to help Patton's landing in Salerno, Italy. The invasion was going to come there, and the mafia was going to be their scouts, yellow flags and all. And 2, which is kind of interesting, we need you to infiltrate the longshoremen and the truckers union to stop infiltration by the unions by the communists. So they were doing the deal making back then, and I can guarantee you Sullivan Cromwell was involved in that deal too, although I don't have any record of that. Dewey, just a little side note, would later name, he was the governor of New York still in 1949 after he lost, had to name a replacement senator in New York in 1949, and he named a guy by the name of John Foster Dulles. Same guy again. Republican elites started to pitch themselves as anti-communists. That was the big thing, as you're a Republican. It's one thing to overthrow the government in 1933. Now you got to get back on the patriot side, so it's anti-commie, anti-commie. All that stuff came out in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. It was anti-communist. They were winning the war of public relations. That changed. We'll get to that maybe. How are we doing on time?
10 to 8.
12.
So I can wrap it up in 15 minutes.
Sure.
Is that good enough? All right. Let's skip a few things. So after the Battle of Midway in 1942, and when the Germans lost to Stalingrad in 1943, it was crystal clear that the Allies were going to win the war. We knew it. The Germans knew it. So if you're in the German high command, what do? Well, these are pretty dedicated people. They really hated communism. They were very much against communism. They go, okay, we'll just make this, fascism thing about, whatever you want to call fascism. They thought it was a good thing. I disagree. I think tyranny under any form is lousy. But they said we'll call this. We lost this battle, World War II. This is one battle in the long-term war of global supremacy. That's how they looked at it. So they started making plans to get out of Dodge. Well, how are you going to do that?
Get a bug out bag.
Phil says, get a bug out bag. So what's going on at the time is, between the Nazi war machine and the American war machine and the Japanese war machine, they're doing all this conquering and a little bit of retreating, stuff like that. They are pillaging every bank, every ounce of gold they can get their hands on. Massive fortunes are moving around the world. In fact, we let the Japanese and the German keep a lot of their gold, and that's how they rebuilt so fast after the war. Operation Paperclip happens, which is where we brought lots of Nazi scientists, stuff like that. The underworld connection with our got to take a step back. So with the OSS is the first American intelligence agency, and they're deeply involved in all of this stuff. And who do you think's running the OSS? Well, that's going to be like the Dulles brothers, the Brown brothers, Harriman. They always bring in these lawyers from Sullivan Cromwell. These are the same people over and over and over again. Something called Operation Golden Lily. 167 different troves of Japanese World War loot was buried in the Philippines, 100 feet down. The Americans got to Japan. They finally found the chauffeur driver, the general who had it, tortured the information out of the chauffeur driver, found these locations. They give it to MacArthur. MacArthur flies all the way back around the world to meet with Truman. And Truman brings in his Secretary of War, Stimson, says, we're $1.2 trillion of gold. We're not going to bring this back. Well, anyways, because I want you to bring in my 3 undersecretaries, and we're gonna have a real meeting. This is too secret, whatever. Long story short, they decided that these War Department's undersecretaries were going to be put in charge of the treasure. A guy by the name of Lovett, remember that name's coming back again. Anderson, and a guy named McCoy. You can forget about McCoy, but Lovett and Anderson matter. Lovett and Anderson were both partners at Brown Brothers Harriman. They created what's called the Secret Anderson Trust to finance right-wing causes around the globe, where they would call right-wing back then. Operation Paperclip, we have Operation Overcast was another one. It's an aggressive campaign to search out all the Third Reich's anti-communist agents and deputize them to run the new West Germany. So our new West German allies, they were all people that were handpicked by our OSS, which is run by the same cabal of people. These people also intervened in the war crime Nuremberg trials, marking the second time that the Dulles brothers had helped Germany out after the war. It's happened again. Allen Dulles is the godfather of the CIA, which was formed in 1947 after Truman ended the OSS due to its dirty tricks and psychological warfare, which he feared would ruin American democratic systems. The CIA was not giving authority to engage in covert actions, which is what Dulles wanted. Allen Dulles helped craft the National Security Act, which really started the security state, which we're living through today. No more private coups. Now when we have an intelligence agency, they'll be US sanctioned. We don't need Sullivan Cromwell to do our coups for us. We'll just use the intelligence agency. It kept on happening. And what do you think Korea and Vietnam or and some of the other places our soldiers have gone and bled for? Did any of us gain from that? No. They gave the covert actions to what's called the OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination, was created by Truman's State Department. This is an important point. The OPC was run by a banker named Frank Wisner, who was also a corporate lawyer, and he was Dulles's right-hand man. The OPC was quickly merged into the CIA when Wisner got caught up in the heroin and opium trade. So from now on, when you hear the CIA and State Department, from pretty much 1949 onwards, they are like this. There's an old joke in Washington, D.C. You meet somebody, I work for the State Department. Oh, are you CIA? I mean, it really is. It is really that bad. So when you hear State Department, and when you look at today's modern politics, when you look at who's drawing sides, you hear the fight between Biden and Kamala and the infighting in D.C. Well, CIA, State Department are always going to go CNN first. That's where they do their leaking. Whereas the FBI always goes to the New York Times. You can see there's all these different patterns in these different factions. They're not all aligned. There's still factions. There's always a bunch of moving parts. Okay. Let's talk about some Bushes. George H.W. Bush gets out of college in 1949 and immediately gets in foreign positions all around the world with energy companies. He has no experience in energy or foreign relations. Yeah, he was CIA with all his family relations. And he had business interests over the next decade or two in many countries the CIA was really active in. They're recruiting, we can skip that. Oh, interesting. They're recruiting ex-Nazis to spy on the Soviet Union right after the war. And the Dulles brothers were running around crushing any news coverage by accusing the newspaper of being front for the Soviet Union. And that worked for about 3 or 4 decades. You call the newspaper the communists, you would shut them up. The coups they carried out were always for the benefit of Brown Brothers Harriman and Sullivan and Cromwell clients. Iran is a great example of this. Early 1950s, Iran wanted its oil. Okay, so what's going on is post-World War II, you have all these European empires are now shrinking. They've lost so much money and had their infrastructure bombed out, one too many world war. And so they started, they can't afford to keep colonies. So all the Europeans are pulling back into their shell, and all these South America, Africa, Asia, all over the world, all these countries are saying we want our independence. And it worked out for some and others not so much. I think our CIA probably had a lot to do with the not so much ones. Iran's an interesting one. They wanted their oil for themselves, not for the UK and the US. Selfish bastards. I hate Iranian names are tough. Mossadegh was the president or premier there. He had, thank you.
Yeah, most of that.
Mossadegh, thank you. He had sought to audit the documents of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the AIOC, which was the big oil company taking all the oil out of there. It was a British corporation, which is now part of British Petroleum, BP, you know, the oil spill guys. And they wanted to limit the company's control over Iranian oil reserves. The AIOC was a Sullivan and Cromwell client, once again. So obviously we can't have that. So Eisenhower greenlights the coup. Mossadegh was painted as a communist to justify it. He wasn't a communist, he was a nationalist. Psychological warfare, false flag attacks, bribery, all managed. Oh, and the entire attack was managed by Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt. Yeah, he's the guy who led the coup. Yeah, Kermit the Roosevelt. Same thing in Guatemala. A Sullivan and Cromwell client, United Fruit, where Alan Dulles sat on the board of directors. We did a coup there. I can keep going on these coups, but I think you guys kind of get this. I put this in bold. The intel agencies had become a tool for corporate raiders. Korea, Vietnam, we skip past that. We know how that went. It was still communism versus anti-communism was a label, but at the end of the day, it was about our corporation, it's corporate profits. It always was war profiteering. What changed? We had these communists versus the versus the fascists, always butting heads throughout the whole century, throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Sometime in the 70s, something changed, and I've got a theory. In 1973, the Trilateral Commission was formed. It's a modern day CFR, Council of Foreign Relations, although CFR is still around and very powerful. Basically, it was David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. I've never been able to say that first name right. They wanted a one world government. That's what they proposed. They were huge leaders in the geopolitical world. They were pushing globalism. They wanted to bring a new world order, which means the undermining of sovereignty of nation states and implementing global government. About 48 years ago today. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. I didn't think they did. What I'm suggesting is that the fascists, nationalists, they've become so powerful and so rich, these global corporations. This is back in the 70s. And they started playing ball with the global banks. And I don't know, I'll tell you who I think sits higher on the rung, but they stopped fighting against each other and fighting against us, is what I think happened. So some real quick connections. About the same time, they worked for the UN to push ideas like global warming and mass immigration. Mm-hmm. Those are the two big things Brzezinski came out of that with those meetings. Did they bury the hatchet, the fascists and the communists? I think they did. They still call each other communists and fascists, but you look at the right, look at the left, look at the establishment, Republicans, Democrats, corporations. You look at any corporation, do you know if they're right or left or just both or none of the above? That's kind of where things change. And I think what happened was globalism hit us. They combined the two ideas. Some real quick connections, and I'll wrap this up. President George H.W. Bush had a special connection with China, one that's unique. As a director of the U.S. Liaison Office, remember he was CIA earlier, from 74 to, he was a U.S. liaison to the People's Republic of China from 74 to 75. He was the United States' second envoy to the country ever. And when he came back from that trip in 74, 75, a lot of U.S. corporations ended up with Chinese contracts. And so I'm sure Bush had his Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers with him. Bush would later become the director of the CIA in 76, 77, right before the hostage crisis. Interesting. As VP a few years later, Bush was the guiding hand of the National Security Council, where with the CIA, they launched what would become the Iran-Contra affair, where we would covertly sell arms to Iran, use the proceeds to fund the Contras to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. Rinse, wash, repeat. Reagan would say in 85, I don't think there's ever been a vice president as much involved at the highest level in our policymaking and our decisions than George. Get that. So Bush Sr. and his relatives have turned the relationships he forged in China into a family franchise over the years, setting themselves as the gatekeepers between the lucrative business opportunities created by opening up China's economy. Prescott Bush Jr., which is GHWB's brother and a 33-year insurance salesman and executive, jumped in the family China business and got into formed the U.S.-China Chamber of Commerce. So if you want to do business, you go through another Bush in China. Over the course of 3 decades, and then we get the Clintons come into this. The Clintons got involved with Mena. You guys have heard about Mena, Arkansas, big CIA. That's probably true. And that's how Clinton got involved with the Bushes. Over the course of 3 decades, they worked like a fine-tuned tag team, setting up China to become the next global superpower. Though ostensibly political rivals, the Clintons had been inducted in the Bush crime family during the 1980s when a small airfield in Mena, Arkansas was used in transport of CIA cocaine. In 1993, Clinton granted most favored nation status to China, paving the way for the whole offshoring of US manufacturing. Bush Jr. arrived in China for a 6-week visit on June 4th, 1975, after finishing Harvard Business School and stayed through his 29th birthday. Apparently, Bush Jr. was really impressed by China's universal healthcare system after he got a tooth fixed for 60 cents. That's out of his dad's diary. In 2001, Bush Jr. ushers China into the WTO. So I'm going to just drop a real quick bunch of facts and connections. We got all the connections to Sullivan Cromwell. We'll kind of explain that. There's one law firms had their fingers in everything. The Brown Brothers Harriman had their fingers in everything. Well, they're all connected by one other thing, and that's a secret society known as Skull and Bones. And a little history on that. Skull and Bones is, you go to Yale University, it's a secret society. They take 15 juniors every year that get named to be part of Skull and Bones. I'm not going to go into the conspiracy side of these things, but there's all kinds of talk about what they do there. So this is 1832. The way it founded was there was a debate club, and the two guys, a couple of groups in the debate club got in an argument. One of them said, well, we don't like you. We're just going to go form Skull and Bones and take over the world, or something like that. So there's some famous bonesmen, and a lot of these names we've heard earlier today, and I'm going to go through this pretty quick. Alonzo Taft, 1832, one of the co-founders. He built the links that tied these people together. He was Ulysses Grant's Secretary of War and AG. And if the name Taft sounds familiar, yeah, his son or grandson became president. William Russell, 1832, the other co-founder. His family made its money in the opium trade. Wrote Blue Blood. Russell Trust still manages the Skull and Bones assets to this day. That's 179 years later. Did I do the math right? Yeah. Morrison Waite, 1837, was a future Supreme Court justice. William H. Taft, 1878. He's the only person in history to serve as both POTUS and on SCOTUS. He's also the man Teddy Roosevelt pushed aside to usher in Woodrow Wilson, which shows that the different factions, the communist side and the fascist side, were fighting even then. So it's interesting. Harold Stanley, 1908, bonesman, co-founder of Morgan Stanley, pretty influential. William Averill Harriman, 1913, the son of railroad tycoon E.H. Harriman and one of the founders of Brown Brothers Harriman. He also inherited the biggest fortune in U.S. history when he got his dad's money. Prescott Bush, 1916, bonesman, also co-founder of Brown Brothers Harriman, among other things. Robert Lovett, remember we talked about him earlier? He was one of the guys that got in charge of the Anderson Trust, all the Philippine gold. Yep. He's a bonesman, friends with Prescott, and was on Truman's War Advisory Board. Henry Luce, 1919, bonesman, founded the world's most influential magazine, Empire. Time, Life, Fortune, and Sports Illustrated. That's a bonesman. George Herbert Walker Jr., 1927. He's a financier and the co-founder of the New York Mets baseball team. Here's one of my favorites. James Jesus Angleton, 1936, bonesman. Heard of him?
Sure.
Oh, got a good memory there. He's a CIA counterintelligence chief. So he's, which club he's in. He was appointed to the Warren Commission investigating the JFK assassination. A lot of people think Angleton's the guy who wrote it. Potter Stewart, 1937 Bonesman, future Supreme Court Justice. But George Bundy's a fun one, 1940 Bonesman, National Security Advisor to Kennedy and LBJ. He was the driving force behind the Vietnam War. He's the son of Robert Lovett, who we talked about earlier, the Anderson Trust, also a Bonesman. He's the brother of Bonesman William Bundy, 1939 Bonesman, who was the State Department liaison for the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. A lot of good connections here. 1948, we had George H.W. Bush, which we all know plenty about. 1950, fun one, William Buckley, father of American conservative movement, founder of the National Review and Firing Line, and the brother of New York U.S. Senator and Bonesman James Buckley. All in the family. Here's a fun one for Bushes. I had, this was a new one to me. Anybody heard of Jonathan James Bush? Another one of the Bushes, 1953. He's the son of Prescott Bush, an investment banker who provides discreet banking in DC and primarily does banking for foreign embassies. Sounds like money laundering to me. John Kerry, 1966. Former VP and Secretary of State who married into the Hines family. And the Hines family, that I must have skipped over because there's a Hines in some of the paragraphs I skipped, and they were very deeply part of the fascists. So John Kerry moved into that one. 1968, we have George W. Bush, who we know plenty about. Guy by the name of Stephen Schwartzman, 1969. He's the CEO of Blackstone Group, currently the second largest landowner in the United States. He's buying up all our real estate. Dana Milbank, 1990, columnist for the Washington Post, who covered Bush and Obama exclusively, inside type deal. And of course, the most recent one who's made any names, 1991, Austin Goolsbee, who I cannot stand. He was the chairman of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. One more name on this I want to drop. Anybody ever heard of Peter Thiel?
Yeah.
A lot of people like him, right? Yeah, he's a Sullivan Cromwell alumni and a former CIA. He was a founder, one of the founders of PayPal. He's the founder of PayPal and a co-founder of Facebook, and he is a Sullivan and Cromwell alumni. So I don't think Peter's really on our side, despite the nice rhetoric. I'm gonna be fun quote for you from John Foster Dulles, one of our stars of the show. Because thus there are two types of people in the world. There are Christians who support free enterprise, and then there are the others. They really believe they were on a Christian crusade. They're not like any Christians I've ever met in my life. These people were pirates. They wanted to live outside the law, above the law, and do whatever the hell they wanted. That's who's been running our country for 100 years. Now we're in a period of time where the globalist bankers and these pirate corporatists and stuff like that, they all seem to be working together to one end. And certainly, I certainly don't think it's an end that I want to be a part of, but that's where we're at. Any questions?
Do we have any chance? Any chance?
How do we fight it? Yeah, of course we do. Because if we didn't, I'd be in the gulag already. You know, the Second Amendment's still intact, and we still got a lot more of us than there are then. The rule of law is not dead. You know, we got, Biden's approval ratings are in the toilet. He's fighting with Kamala, which, dem on dem crime is the most entertaining thing I've ever seen.
Brady is Dulles and Dulles Airport.
Absolutely.
Yep.
But there's two Dulleses. So in the 1950s, we had Alan Dulles was the running the CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles was running the State Department. You want to talk about power? And you got President Truman, then Eisenhower. Eisenhower's very friendly to Dulleses. Truman put up a bit of resistance, but they've been going in and out of the State Department and all the controls of power, for a good 75, 100 years. I forgot what's wrong with this picture. And I mean, we don't have royalty in America. We just don't. So that's not, none of this stuff's okay.
So basically, George Carlin said it all in 2 sentences.
George Carlin has never been wrong in his life.
He's a philosopher.
One big club that you made.
Yeah.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Linda says George Carlin's right. It's one big club and you ain't in it. No, it's absolutely true. Yes.
Do you have any recommended books about this stuff?
Yeah, I could probably come up with some. I got a lot of this stuff more off websites and stuff like that, but there's some I can definitely send you some good books on that. I'll make a list and give it to you next time I see you. or I'll bring it to everybody. But yeah, there's none of this stuff is, I didn't make any of it up. It's all sourced, but we're not taught this in schools.
Right.
And that's why I keep coming here. Is, I went to decent schools and I read the curriculum.
Would you be willing to email those footnotes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, do I have a sign up sheet, Casey? Yeah, put it on the sheet. The people signed up last week. You got my email, right? With the notes from last time? I hope you did. I sent out the email.
I got a few bounced back to me, but.
Well, anyways, yes, yeah, Vince, I'll absolutely give you the notes. In fact, you can have these because you're a friend. Any other questions? All right, it's time for
Let's do the raffle.
time for the raffle.